The following is a look at the killers of Dead by Daylight, and any real-world equivalents they might have. Let's continue. Danny Johnson, aka the Ghostface. This is the only killer of my DBD projects that's licensed. However, only the costume is a registered asset, with the character himself being an original creation by behaviour. Danny Johnson is original enough for inclusion in this project, but what I'm most interested in is he's another example of a true serial killer. Again in the early 90s and going by the name of Jed Olson, he's working as a journalist while writing about his own crimes. And his own crimes involve several murders. The victims were apparently random with little in common with each other, suggesting this is another killer that doesn't have a type. The crime scenes showed murder by a frenzied stabbing, but also showed a high degree of planning and calculation. Breaking in was a typical aspect of his modus operandi, and he was said to stalk his targets for weeks before striking. What sort of man was he? The base law uses adjectives such as modest, honest, and enthusiastic. The base law is as vague as it is brief, but we once again see that psychopathic charm in action, as Olson got a job at a newspaper. He even got to interview the families of his victims, which is a cruel dramatic irony. Kidnapper Ariel Castro attempted to get close to the families of his victims, and there are many examples of killers trying to insert themselves into the investigation or the story. Another similar example is Ian Huntley, who was very active in the search of two young girls, despite him being responsible for their murders. Johnson, by contrast, was much more accomplished, and a far more organised and meticulous killer. It won't do to compare him to anything other than a serial killer rather than a kidnapper or double murderer, much less a fictional character. But I can't resist describing him as an evil Peter Parker of sorts. His base lore doesn't have much to work with, but the tome is an absolute treasure trove of insight into the mind of a killer. It's a very good story, worthy of consideration for multiple reasons. And there's one detail I'd like to iron out before I truly begin. The tome indulges in a rather lengthy aside revolving around Danny's anthropology class. The teacher focuses on the best of human nature, whilst Danny focuses on the worst. I've seen this kind of cynicism before, and it's worse than some edgelord. During the 100 SKP, I made a small allusion to the loneliness of a psychopath, and what it entails. Given they lack the empathy to see things from another point of view, they find themselves judging others by their own principles, or lack thereof. Everyone is as evil and selfish and cruel as they are, and any evidence or insistence to the contrary can't even be considered. Look, I'm talking way out of turn. I don't know anything for certain, but this self-isolating cynicism does make sense to how the psychopath views the world. It's all theory, and radical theory at that. But you know what they say about suspicious minds? They're suspicious. But looking at the Ghostface, I don't want to focus on psychopathy just yet, but instead its theatrical cousin, narcissistic personality disorder. I've talked about NPD a few times now, showing characters who are arrogant, attention-seeking, grandiose, but Danny is all of that in spades. I've also covered characters that have been invested in fantasy before, but Danny Johnson takes that to a new level. It's almost as if he sees murder as art, and he's heavily invested in crime and fiction alike, to the extent that he's prepared to kill for it. There are more obvious signs, like the attention-seeking behaviour of reporting your own crimes in the press. Yeah, that's pretty narcissistic. He's clearly disempathic, but it's the investment in fantasy which I think is key. It's for these reasons I consider Ghostface to be the first killer of Dead by Daylight to truly be pathologically narcissistic. Now, let's look at ego, or rather disband some notions. I'm not comfortable talking about ego within the context of narcissism. I happen to agree with the theory that narcissists don't actually have an ego at all, so accusations of egoism are something of a misnomer? Look, an ego is a realistic view of oneself, an honest self-concept. The narcissist has a different psychodynamic construct to the ego called the false self. It's better than a realistic self-concept. The false self is God. It's perfect. It's divine. It's better than you. To question this construct is tantamount to very real blasphemy. An assault of the ego is one thing. An assault on the false self is everything the narcissist is, or rather, everything he projects himself to be. The false self needs to be perceived as real. It's reality, and other people must acknowledge it. I'm going to argue that the murder spree that takes place in Ghostface's tome was the result of a narcissistic injury from others not taking him seriously. This negation of his existence, and to other killers both real and fictional, can only be punished by death. The core reason being that pathological narcissism is inherently a compensatory disorder, the most potent example of copium you could possibly imagine, and the most terrifying. Are there real-world examples of this? I'm reminded of Raoul Moat, a would-be spree killer that went on the run in 2010. When the press started mocking him, he got very upset and threatened to kill members of the public because of it. The police ordered a press blackout in response. But this case is very different. There's also the case of serial killer Israel Keyes, who didn't like how the papers reported on his crimes and stopped cooperating with the investigation. Wayne Williams, the Atlanta boogeyman, was also involved in the police investigation, and he even held a press conference at one point. There are a few others I'll cover in a bit, but as far as I know, these individuals weren't diagnosed as pathologically narcissistic. After all, you don't need to be completely self-obsessed to care about what others say about you. I'm sure John Douglas thought as much of Williams, but I can't be sure. So far, I've not drawn for my own project, but that's going to change as I start with the most obvious comparison. Danny Rolling, aka the Gainesfield Ripper. Himself the loose inspiration for the original Scream films which popularised the iconic mask, he was someone who would break in, rape, and stab the victims to death before posing their bodies for the cops to find. It occurs to me that the killers of the Scream films were mostly teenagers and idiots who often didn't have to break in, whilst DBD's Ghostface is actually closer to the real-world inspiration than they ever were. It simply can't be a coincidence that his first name is Danny. I mean, come on! Comparisons don't end there. The Freudian excuse. Danny Rolling and Danny Johnson both had fathers who served in the army. It's clear that Rolling hated his father, but Johnson I'm not so sure about. He may even have respected him and committed his murders as some weird tribute. There's also the implication that Ghostface killed his own father, but that's not confirmed, with only vague references to design. Why kill his own father? Did he hate him? Was he abusive like Rawlings was? The Gainesfield Ripper also tried to kill his dad, but failed. As we can see, there's a lot of overlap. But what strikes me the most about Ghostface is how meticulous and organised he was. His tome did demonstrate some impulsivity, but his wider crime spree was carefully orchestrated like, well, a story. He's a textbook, organised serial killer, and I draw comparisons between some of the more tactical cases of the project. Joseph DeAngelo, aka the Golden State Killer, and Dennis Rader, aka BTK, Bind, Torture, Kill. Both of these men would also break into their victims' houses. DeAngelo in particular enjoyed targeting middle-class couples who thought they were safe. Both were very well organised and particular in how they approached their crimes. Most significantly, both of them taunted the press. Ghostface actually was the press he was taunting. Again, I still can't believe how narcissistic that is. And speaking of narcissism, Rader was officially diagnosed with NPD, adding a further connection. But even creepier, Rader was also diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder. And if you've read Ghostface's tome, that's not a stretch at all. But wait, there's more. Ghostface cut the phone line of one would-be victim. Dennis Rader was notorious for doing this as well. Both Ghostface and BTK had a victim obliviously survive them, and the killers disliked it intensely when things didn't go according to plan. Rader referred to his stalking and readying for a kill as a project, while Ghostface used the term design. This speaks to how both viewed their evil as just a game. Just a game. Maybe. Or maybe it's very serious business indeed. But to indulge in another quick aside, I get the impression Ghostface's tome is to subtly attack the more obsessive fans of Dead by Daylight. Design versus criticism of DBD. Those who can't criticize. Ghostface is a rather unappealing narcissistic mirror of the man-children that populate this community. Let's take a moment to remind ourselves it's all just a game before we continue. Let's not be the mirror image of Ghostface and BTK, who saw their crimes as a game, and we as people who wrongly see this game as a real-life crime. In case I haven't made it clear yet, I really love this tome. It's truly brilliant stuff, but I'm not done yet. Have you ever heard of Vlado Teneski? Let me read the wiki intro for you. He was a Macedonian journalist and serial killer who was arrested in June 2008 for the murders of 2 women, on whose deaths he had also written freelance articles. Oh my god. I really wish Taneski could have been part of my project. Maybe one day I'll do a part 2 if people ask for it. Hint hint. But I'm still not done. Have we forgotten about Jack Unterwenger? After his release from prison for murder, he got a job as a respected journalist and resumed his life as a serial killer, even reporting on the very crimes he'd committed. I'm at a loss for words. You'd think the story of Danny Johnson would be unrealistic, but you'd be wrong apparently. The finer details of Jack Unterwenger I don't have access to as I don't speak Austrian, but his MO didn't involve breaking in or stabbing. Instead, he strangled prostitutes with their own bras. But I couldn't ask for a better final note to mention that Jack Unterwenger was also diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. Ghostface loves the infamy and the dramatic irony he can inflict as he walks around the normal people who don't have a clue. Once again, Rolling wanted to be famous for his murders, and so did BTK. Colin Ireland, the gay slayer, also wanted that status, as did a few others throughout the years. But Danny isn't getting the narcissistic supply. The false self is. And the false self is not the narcissist. The false self is a phantom generated by the narcissist. The narcissist is an absence, a vacuum. At the very best, it's a deeply wounded or even fossilized dead child. It's at this point I'd like to talk about covert narcissism. Sometimes called vulnerable narcissism, shy narcissism, compensatory narcissism. There are loads of terms, and some of them have distinct meanings from each other, but very broadly, they fall into the same subtype of narcissists. Understated, quiet, introverted. Unfortunately, there's so much garbage on the phenomenon it'll take an entire video to sort through it all, and I'm not up to that task, so I need to skim and oversimplify even harder than I have already been thus far. Hopefully I can build a general idea, and this idea starts with understanding personality. Overt versus covert might as well be extroverted versus introverted. I don't know if Ghostface fits the personality profile. In his lore he comes across as quite bold and confident, rather than shy and reticent. A typical covert narcissist personality would be more along the lines of Dwight or Claudette, with an Ace Visconti or Feng Ming vibe to them. They're very strange people, but they're no less narcissistic and no less dangerous. Again, I don't want to attack the mentally ill. It's not fair. Few narcissists are psychopaths, and even fewer are sadists, and even fewer are murderers. In fact, Salman Tar believes the covert variant actually does have a conscience, as well as a marked propensity for feelings of shame and neurosis. Nevertheless, this is a particularly insidious mental illness. I really wish there was even more lore for Ghostface, but as is, we do have clues. He wears dark colours as opposed to bright, flashy colours, at least most of the time. What the hell even is this? This doesn't make him a covert, but combined with a stealth killer power, it starts to paint a picture mechanically. I always thought it was a very odd decision to have a character's stealth ability be nullified by looking at them. I think I understand now, though. This is a good mechanical representation of social anxiety, and coverts, sometimes called shy narcissists, are riddled with such neurotic tics. But at this point, I must admit I'm likely reading far too much into all of this. Again. How Ghostface behaves and why he does what he does suggests a callous selfishness and a desperate need to be noticed, even if indirectly. There's a disregard, even a silly playfulness to his murderous game. His lore suggests he was a peeping Tom, and this is a trait shared by Fred West, Ed Kemper, Chikatilo, and Danny Rolling and Dennis Rader. Final thoughts? Photographs of the crime, as well as that Maury. I'm a little funny including in-game actions, but I think the lore supports this as well. Taking photographs is surprisingly common amongst serial killers. It got 16 hits during the project, with notable examples being Narcissist, Rodney Alcala, Scorecard Killer Randy Kraft, and, once again, Dennis BTK Raider. The in-game character is a stealth killer at a time when stealth killers were popular. However, he was always derided as being weak. I'm a huge fan of the buff that prevents survivors from breaking his stealth while they are fully stalked. It does a great job of making you feel vulnerable, at the mercy of a killer. But his old iterations made him feel more like Scary Movie than Scream, something I know old Danny wouldn't have liked very much at all. As for his current state, this might be another case of dreaded mid-tier hell, at best. Nevertheless, I'm really glad he's with us. I'm saddened that this wasn't a full chapter. As is, it's easily my favourite paragraph of Dead by Daylight with one of my favourite killers. But I have an issue with the trailer. Why is the open package bloody? It's for a knife. And how did Ghosty get it out of the package? With a smaller bloody knife? Why do that? Why didn't Carl notice that the guy behind the was dressed as Ghost? Alright, I'll stop here. Okay. I don't have much else to say except to ask, so, what's your favourite scary movie?